The proximity alarm sang through the training hull for the 9th time in 6 minutes, and Tomas Reyes still had not fired. Around him, the simulated bridge of the Ansel's Reach pulsed amber, every console screaming the same verdict his instructors would scream in a moment. The enemy formation is closing, the firing solution is clean, why are you not shooting? Cadet Priya Ose's voice cracked through the comm from the gunnery pit, sharp with the particular fear of someone who has done everything right and is about to lose anyway. Reyes, weapons are hot. What are we waiting for? What they were waiting for was a number that didn't add up. The Vantar Raider formation on his tactical display was arranged in a perfect wedge, textbook aggression, and textbook aggression was the one thing Wick-Than's sensor returns kept insisting it wasn't. Hold, Reyes said. 3 decks below the observation gallery, behind glass thick enough to survive a hull breach, Instructor Keith Varanen watched a green light flatten into red and did not blink. He did not need to. He had seen this exact shape of failure 100 times across 100 cadets, in 100 simulated deaths that cost nothing and taught everything, and he had learned to recognize its opening posture, the way a hunter recognizes wind before it moves the grass. The posture was always the same. A capable officer, faced with a clean shot, would find a reason to want more information instead of taking it. The reason would sound intelligent. It would sound careful. It would get people killed at a speed too slow for the enemy to notice and too fast for anyone else to stop. Fire, Reyes said 4 seconds too late, and the wedge formation broke apart into 6 smaller shapes that had been hiding inside the sensor ghost of 1, and by the time the simulated point defense grid recalculated for 6 independent contacts instead of 1 cohesive mass, the Ansel's Reach had already lost forward shields, aft thrusters, and on the scoring display that mattered to no one except every single person who would remember it for years, the exercise. The lights came up. Cadets peeled themselves out of crash harnesses in the ringing silence that follows every simulated death, the particular quiet of people recalculating what they thought they knew about themselves. Voronen's voice arrived over the hull speakers before anyone reached the ladder down. It did not shout. Vantar rarely shouted. Shouting was for pack members who had already lost the argument. Cadet Reyes, you had a firing solution at second 11. You held it for 140 compute cycles while asking your engineering rating to re-verify a sensor return that had already been verified. In that time, 6 real weapons batteries would have found 6 real targeting locks on your hull. Explain to me what you were doing with those cycles. Reyes stood at the base of the ladder, sweat cooling under his collar, and made the mistake, the honest mistake, the true one, of answering the question instead of defending himself. The wedge was too clean, he said. Real raiders don't fly formation like they're posing for a recruitment poster. I wanted Wick to confirm it wasn't a composite return before I committed the ship to a target that might not. You wanted. Voronen's crest feathers lay flat against his skull, a stillness that cadets learned eventually to fear more than any display of temper. A commander does not want confirmation in the moment of contact. A commander has already built the judgment that confirmation exists to replace. You did not trust your own read of the field. You trusted a subordinate's instrument instead, and while you waited for permission to believe your own eyes, this crew died. He let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. You are a capable tactician, Cadet Reyes. Your marks in navigation and gunnery theory are among the best in this cohort. But capability without decisiveness is a loaded weapon with no one willing to close the trigger guard. I have watched this pattern kill better officers than you will ever be, in circumstances with considerably less mercy than a training deck. You are unfit for command. I will be noting that assessment in your record today, and I do not expect to need to revise it. He turned and left the observation gallery before Reyes could answer, which was, Reyes would understand much later, its own kind of mercy, because there was nothing Reyes could have said that would have sounded like anything other than proving the point. Threshold Station did not forget verdicts. It repeated them gently, constantly in 100 small currencies. The seat no one saved for him in the mess hall that week, the flight rotations he was quietly rotated out of, the particular way Priya Ose's crew stopped including his name when they talked about who they wanted assigned to their eventual postings. Nobody was cruel about it. That was almost worse. It was simply understood, the way weather is understood, that Tomas Reyes had been measured by the single most respected command instructor in the Concord fleet and found wanting, and that this was now simply a fact about him, filed alongside his height and his blood type. He kept his data terminal open past curfew for 3 nights running, pulling the sensor logs from the failed exercise and running them again and again, not to excuse himself, but because he needed badly to know whether he had been right. The wedge formation had been a composite ghost. Wick's confirmation had come through eventually, 4 seconds after Reyes gave the order to fire, which meant that in the world of the simulation, Reyes had been correct and dead at the same time, which was, he was beginning to understand, the entire problem with being correct on a timeline nobody was grading. "You're chewing on this like a Vantar chews a grudge," Wick Than observed from the terminal beside his. The Ilsu engineer's voice came out with the faint crystalline resonance of a species that had no vocal cords in the way most species meant the term, sound generated instead by controlled vibration through silicate lattice, so that every word Wick spoke carried a faint, unintentional harmonic, like a bell rung under a blanket. "It is not a flattering resemblance. I was right. You were correct about the sensor return. You were incorrect about what correctness is for." Wick's 4 data manipulators paused over the console, an Ilsu gesture that Reyes had learned meant something between a shrug and a held breath. "On my world, we are taught that the value of an observation is in its use, not its accuracy. A perfectly accurate observation delivered too late to matter is not a virtue. It is a eulogy with excellent sourcing. That's grim. It is Ilsu. We are a grim people who build very good sensors." A pause, the harmonic settling into something almost gentle. "For what it costs, which is little, since I am not the one whose file now says unfit. I have run radar engagement data back 400 incidents. Formation wedges that clean appear in 11% of real engagements, not 0. Instructor Varanin did not lie to you. He gave you the doctrine that keeps 90% of crews alive. You were arguing for the 11% with 140 compute cycles to make your case, in a simulation designed by the 90% doctrine to punish exactly that argument at exactly that speed. Reyes sat with that for a long moment. So he's right. He is right about what he built his doctrine to protect against. Whether that is the same thing as being right about you, Wick's manipulators folded, is a separate question that a simulation cannot answer, because a simulation only ever tests the thing it was built to test. It was not comfort, exactly. But it was the first thing anyone had said to him in 3 days that treated the verdict as a hypothesis rather than a sentence, and Reyes found he could sleep after it a little. The Vantar did not build their command doctrine from nothing, and if Reyes had known the shape of the wound underneath it, he might have understood the classroom differently, though understanding it would not, in the end, have changed a single thing that happened next, because Keith Varanin had built a wall around that wound so carefully, over so many years, that he had stopped being able to see it as a wall at all. To him, by now, it simply looked like the horizon. He had commanded the strike cruiser Deep Current Varanin. Vantar vessels of command rank carried their captain's bloodline as part of the ship's own name, an old custom from when clan and crew had been the same word. For 11 years before the Threra Strait engagement. And in all that time he had never once doubted the fitness of his second-in-command, because his second-in-command was his sister's son, Dreth, raised from hatching, to understand that command was a birthright proven through decisiveness the way a Vantar cliffhunter proves itself through the kill, fast and total, and without the luxury of a second attempt. At Threra Strait, an enemy formation had come in wrong. Too clean, too textbook. Dreth had asked for 4 minutes to re-verify the sensor ghost before committing the Deep Current Varanin's main batteries to a target lock that did not, by his read, add up. Keith had overridden him. 4 minutes in a live engagement was an eternity a commander did not have the right to spend. He had ordered the batteries to fire on his own authority, decisively, the way command required, the way 60 generations of Vantar doctrine promised would keep a crew alive. And the formation had been exactly what Dreth suspected, a composite ghost hiding a mine cluster that the Deep Current Varanin's own weapons discharge triggered at point-blank range. 211 crew died in the 11 seconds that followed, including Keith's mate, who had served as the ship's surgeon, and including, though this detail had, over 18 years, worn smooth in Keith's memory the way a stone wears smooth in a river, until it no longer had any sharp edges left to cut him. Dreth himself, who had been standing at the tactical station arguing for 4 more minutes when the bulkhead behind him failed. The official inquiry, conducted by Vantar officers who had every institutional reason to protect the Doctrine rather than question it, recorded the cause as hesitation at the tactical station, resulting in delayed threat assessment and compromised formation integrity. It did not specify whose hesitation. Keith had never corrected the ambiguity. He had let it stand, and over the years, the story had simplified itself in the telling, the way stories about the dead always do, until in Keith Varanen's own memory the tragedy of Threra Strait was no longer "I overrode a good officer's caution and killed my crew." It had become, cleanly and completely, a young officer hesitated, and I have spent every year since making sure it never happens under my command again. He believed this the way a man believes the shape of a scar he has never turned around to look at directly. It was, in its way, the kindest lie he had ever told himself, and the most expensive. The next 4 months gave Reyes exactly nothing he could point to as proof of anything, which was, in its own quiet way, a kind of education. He flew 100 simulated hours. He passed his engineering cross-certification with marks that made his instructors raise their crests in something that was almost approval. He did not stop pausing before he pulled a trigger, but he learned to pause faster, to build his questions into the seconds he already had instead of the seconds he wished he had. And if Voronene noticed the improvement, he did not say so, because Voronene's file on Cadet Reyes had already closed, in the particular way that a mind closes a question it believes it has already answered correctly. The real test, when it came, arrived wearing the shape of something almost boring. A supply escort rotation, 3 light craft shepherding a civilian transport through the Kesh Reef corridor, low risk. The kind of posting given to cadets in their final training cycle specifically, because nothing was supposed to happen. Ensign Priya Ose had command of the escort wing. She had earned it the way Voronen's doctrine said command should be earned. Decisively, visibly, every call fast and clean and defensible in the after-action report, even when it was wrong, because a Vantar-trained review board forgave speed and punished hesitation, and Priya had learned that lesson as thoroughly as anyone in the cohort. Reyes flew her second ship, with Wick Than seated at the engineering board behind him, the two of them assigned together now on the strength of a working relationship. Neither instructor nor cadet had officially sanctioned, but everyone had quietly stopped questioning. 6 hours into the corridor transit, Wick's board lit up with a fluctuation in the transport's drive containment field, a shimmer so small it would not have registered on any system not specifically tuned to notice the difference between ordinary mechanical noise and the particular harmonic signature of a stress fracture in a plasma containment coil, 11 minutes from catastrophic failure. Priya. Reyes had the comm open before Wick finished the sentence. Transport's containment field is drifting. Wick's reading a fracture pattern in the coil housing, not a sensor artifact. Recommend immediate standoff and emergency venting before we're inside the blast radius. Confirmed on my board? Priya's voice was already moving, already deciding. That was the thing about her Reyes had never resented. Not really. She was good. Genuinely good. Fast in the way the Doctrine wanted and right often enough that the speed earned its keep. I'm not reading anything on primary telemetry. You won't. It's below your board's resolution threshold. Wick's instruments are tuned finer. A half-second pause, which for Priya Ose was an agony. Command doctrine is standoff requires primary confirmation, not secondary systems. I can't reroute the whole formation off an ILSU engineering read with no primary corroboration. Reyes, that's not how the call gets made. Then make the call on me instead of the Doctrine. I'm telling you the coil's going to fail. Noted. Continuing on assigned vector, full alert status, stand ready to assist if telemetry corroborates. It was, by every rule Priya had been trained under, the correct answer. Real, believable risk, insufficiently confirmed, addressed with vigilance rather than a formation-wide, deviation that would need justifying to a review board later. It was also wrong, and Reyes knew it was wrong with a certainty that sat in his chest like a stone, and he did the thing that the last 4 months had taught him to do, which was not enough. He pushed once more. Priya, I need 30 seconds to get Wix data onto your board directly. Just look at the raw feed before. And she said, not unkindly, I hear you. Hold position. And that was the entire argument because Reyes did not insist. He had a correct reading and an instinct screaming that it mattered, and he deferred to the ranking officer's call the way 4 months of quietly rebuilding his standing had taught him to defer, because pushing harder than that, overriding a superior's judgment as a junior escort pilot with a file that already said unfit, was not a thing he had permission, in his own mind, to do. The coil failed at minute 9. The transport's automated bulkhead sealed in time to save the ship and every soul aboard, except one dockhand doing a manual inspection in the containment bay, who did not get clear before the seal, and whose name Reyes would learn that night and would not, for a very long time, be able to say out loud without his throat closing. The after-action review cleared everyone of fault. Priya's decision had matched Doctrine precisely. The loss was filed as an unavoidable mechanical casualty, no different in the review board's language from equipment failure on any other transit. Nobody blamed Reyes. Nobody needed to. He blamed himself with a thoroughness that made the room's forgiveness feel almost obscene, because he understood, with a clarity that had nothing comforting in it, exactly what Voronin had meant in that observation gallery 4 months earlier. He had been right. He had been right, and had known he was right, and had let the shape of correct procedure matter more than the shape of the thing he could see happening in front of him. Not because he lacked judgment, but because he lacked the nerve to insist on it against a superior's word, and a dockhand named Osei Farrell, no relation to Priya, a coincidence that made the guilt worse somehow, had died of that particular shortfall. You saw it and you didn't insist, he told himself, lying awake that night, and it sounded exactly like Voronin's voice. And for the first time since the classroom, Reyes did not have an argument to make back. Wick found him on the observation deck 2 days later, watching the Kesh Reef corridor slide past the viewport, stars smeared thin by the transit lensing. You have decided the instructor was correct, Wick said. It was not a question. Ilsu did not usually bother with questions when a statement would do the same work faster. He said capability without decisiveness is a weapon with no one willing to close the trigger guard. I had the read. I had it faster than her board did, and I let her doctrine outrank my certainty because I didn't trust myself enough to make her listen. Reyes didn't turn from the window. That's not a sensor problem, Wick, that's a me problem. May I offer a correction to your framing, which I think is built on an error. Wick's manipulators settled against the rail beside him, 4 small, deliberate points of contact. You have concluded that the lesson of Farrell's death is insist harder next time, be more like Voronin. I would put to you a different lesson, which is that you correctly identified a danger, correctly escalated it through the proper channel, and were overruled by an officer operating exactly within the doctrine she was trained to trust. The failure was not in your judgment. It was in a command culture that has no mechanism for a subordinate's certainty to outweigh a superior's procedure, even when the subordinate is right and says so clearly. You are trying to solve that failure by becoming more like the doctrine that caused it. I do not think that is arithmetic that resolves. So what, I should have mutinied over a coil reading? I am not telling you what you should have done. I am telling you what is true, which is a different service than advice, and in my experience, the more useful one. A pause, the harmonic in Wick's voice dropping into something quieter. You are a good officer who trusted a bad system to catch what you had already caught yourself. That is not the same story as unfit for command. But I understand why it feels identical from inside it. Grief is a poor cartographer. It draws every road back to the same door. Reyes did not answer for a long time. Below them, the transit lensing straightened as the ship cleared the corridor's far end, stars snapping back into their ordinary, distant places. I keep waiting to feel like he was wrong about me, he said finally. I don't. I just feel like I don't know what right would even look like anymore. Then it is fortunate, Wick said, with the particular dryness that passed in an ilsu for something almost like affection. That you will not have to wait very much longer to find out. The Concord Joint Fleet Review convened at Threshold Station 11 weeks later, an event that happened once every 4 years and existed for exactly the reason its name implied. Senior officers from every member species of the Concorde, Vantar included, gathered aboard the flagship Compact's Word to observe a live-fire joint exercise between graduating cadet crews and a genuine, if controlled, opposing force drawn from Concorde Border Patrol assets. It was, everyone understood, closer to real combat than anything the Academy simulated. And it was also, everyone understood, the single most watched event of a cadet's career. The kind of thing that made or ended reputations in front of exactly the people whose opinions would follow a young officer for the next 30 years. Instructor Keith Varanen sat in the flag officers' gallery of the Compact's Word for the review, not as an evaluator of the exercise itself, but as an honored elder of Vantar Command Doctrine, invited to observe the next generation prove, or fail to prove, that his life's teaching had produced what it promised. Cadet Reyes had been assigned for the review as third officer aboard the escort frigate Halverson under Ensign Priya Osei's command, with Wick Than once again at the engineering board. The same working triangle that had failed a dockhand named Farrell 11 weeks earlier, reassembled now in front of half the Concorde's senior fleet leadership, which struck Reyes, boarding the Halverson, as either a mercy or a cruelty, and he could not decide which. The opposing force that day was a squadron of decommissioned Vantar raiders, refitted for controlled exercise fire, running a live ammunition simulation that everyone aboard understood carried genuine if managed risk. The entire design of the joint review being that cadets should feel the weight of consequence without the exercise actually courting disaster. That design held for the first 40 minutes. At minute 41, the lead raiders' containment systems, decommissioned military hardware, older than half the cadets aboard, maintained by a peacetime budget that had quietly deferred 3 consecutive refit cycles because the ships were never meant to fire live rounds again, failed in a way that had nothing to do with anyone's tactics, and everything to do with corroded feed lines nobody had inspected closely enough. The failure did not simply disable the raider. It triggered an uncontrolled discharge cascade through its weapons bus, and the raider's live ordnance, the ordnance everyone had assumed was calibrated to exercise-safe yields, began firing on programmed exercise targeting logic with real yields, because the safety interlock that should have prevented exactly this had corroded shut along with everything else. The Halverson took the first strike across its command deck. Reyes came up from the deck plating with his ears ringing, and the smell of burnt insulation thick enough to taste, and the first thing his eyes found, through smoke and the red wash of emergency lighting, was Priya Osei slumped against the command chair's ruined frame, unconscious, a gash along her scalp bleeding freely, and beyond her the frigate's captain, a senior Vantar officer named Sorel Osin, assigned to oversee the graduating cadets for exactly this review, pinned beneath a fallen support strut with 2 of his 4 limbs clearly, badly broken, conscious but in a species-specific shock that Reyes had no training to address. And beyond the captain, secured to an observer's harness that had not been designed to survive a hit like this and barely had, Instructor Keith Varanen, his crest torn, one wing folded at an angle that spoke of a fracture, alive, aware, and, for the first time in Reyes's experience of him, entirely, completely silent, because there was nothing in 18 years of doctrine that told him what to say to a cadet standing in the wreckage of a command deck with every officer senior to that cadet either unconscious or unable to lead. Sensor board still live. Wick's voice cut through the ringing in Reyes's ears, harmonic strained but functional. Reyes, I have partial telemetry. You are the highest functioning officer on this deck. The words landed with a weight that had nothing to do with rank insignia and everything to do with simple arithmetic. Priya was down. Osin was down. Varanen was an observer with no vessel authority even conscious and whole. And there was no one else. Reyes was not being given command. There was, in the most literal sense available, no one left to give it to anyone else. Talk to me, he said, and was distantly grateful his voice did not shake. Second raider in the squadron has taken damage from the same cascade. Its containment field is failing on the same corroded pattern, projected uncontrolled discharge in approximately 90 seconds. If it goes the way the first one did, it will not simply fire wild. Corroded feed lines of this vintage tend to fail catastrophically rather than gracefully. I am reading a coupling signature that suggests the ship's entire reactor housing is one failure away from a containment breach, not a weapons discharge. If that raider goes and we are still inside the blast envelope, this frigate does not survive it regardless of shields. Options. We run and there's a 90% chance we clear the envelope in time, based on current thrust reserves. Or a half-second pause, the only hesitation Wick allowed itself in the entire exchange. We do not run. We use the Halverson's tractor emitters, which are still functional, to seize the failing raider and haul it bodily away from the review formation before its reactor breaches, which would save the compact's word and every ship in the gallery cluster, including everyone aboard them at the cost of holding our own hull far closer to the blast than any safety margin permits. Reyes looked at the tactical display, at the bright cluster of icons representing the flagship and its gallery of senior officers from every member species of the Concorde, close enough to the failing raider that a reactor breach at full yield would tear through shielding never designed to survive point-blank military-grade destruction. Run was the decision Doctrine wanted. Decisive, immediate, self-preserving, defensible in exactly the language Varanen's classroom had spent a year teaching an entire cohort to speak. It would very likely work. It would also, if it did not work, mean nothing else mattered, because the compact's word would still be sitting inside the blast radius with no one having tried to move it. 90% isn't good enough when the 90 I lose is everyone in that gallery, Reyes said, and felt, saying it, the exact shape of the thing Varanen had accused him of in the observation deck a lifetime ago. The refusal to commit cleanly to the fast, defensible answer, except this time he understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that it was not indecision. It was a decision, made in full, that simply cost more to make than the other one did. Wick, can the emitters hold a raider that size at that range without the coupling failing on our end? I do not know. I have never had cause to calculate it because no one sane builds an exercise around it. Best estimate, 60%. If you give Sail the aft emitter array manually the instant I mark it, automated coupling won't compensate fast enough for a mass that size. Sail Ithrin was 19 years old, a Vantar cadet on his first live-fire rotation, currently white-eyed and rigid at the aft engineering station, close enough to hear every word of the exchange happening around him, and Reyes turned to him because there was no one else to turn to. Sail, can you do it? The young cadet's crest was flat with a fear that had nothing performative in it. I've run the simulation 11 times. I have never held a live coupling that size. I know. I'm not asking if you're certain. I'm asking if you can do it anyway. Something in the plain honesty of the question, the refusal to pretend the fear away, the refusal to promise Sail a safety Reyes did not actually have to give him, seemed to steady the cadet more than confidence would have. Yes, sir, he said. And it was the first time in Reyes's life anyone had called him that and meant it as a fact rather than a formality. Wick, mark him the instant the coupling's ready. Everyone else brace. The next 90 seconds did not feel like 90 seconds. Reyes watched the tactical display with a stillness he did not recognize in himself. The old instinct to pause and verify folded now into something that had stopped being hesitation at all. It had become simply the shape of his attention. Fast and careful at once, the two things he had spent a year believing were opposites turning out, in the only moment that had ever actually mattered, to be the same muscle. Wick's voice called the mark. Sail's hands moved on the manual coupling with a precision that had nothing to do with confidence, and everything to do with having been given, at the exact right second, a task small enough to be possible and clear enough to trust. The tractor beam caught the failing raider at 11 seconds to spare. The Halverson's hull screamed with a stress groan that every soul aboard felt in their teeth, alarms cascading across boards that had never been rated for this kind of load. And for 4 seconds, Reyes would count them later precisely, obsessively, the way a person counts the seconds of the worst thing they have ever lived through. The coupling held at the very edge of failure while the frigate's engines burned hard enough to drag 600,000 tons of dying warship out past the gallery cluster's shield envelope. The Raider's reactor breached at second 5, well clear of the compact's word, well clear of everything except the Halverson itself, which took the shockwave's outer edge across already battered shielding and held, barely, systems screaming, hull integrity in the red but intact, every soul aboard alive except one. The aft coupling housing, overloaded past every rated tolerance in the final second of the breach's shockwave, blew outward in a containment failure of its own, small, contained, survivable for the ship, catastrophic for the one person standing directly in front of it. Sci-Fi, who had held the manual coupling exactly as long as it needed to be held, exactly as steadily as it needed to be held, did not have time to clear the station before the housing failed. Reyes reached him within seconds. It was not enough. There was nothing in the wreckage of that engineering alcove that would have been enough, and he knelt there, holding a 19-year-old cadet's hand while the boy's breathing slowed and stopped, aware with a horror that would not leave him for the rest of his life. That the ship, the gallery, the compact's word, and every senior officer of the Concord aboard it were alive because of a decision Reyes had made, and that the decision had cost exactly what it cost, and that there had never, from the moment Wick gave him the numbers, been a version of this where the arithmetic came out clean. The compact's word sent emergency response craft within minutes. By the time medical teams reached the Halverson's command deck, Priya Ose was stable, Captain Aasen had been stabilized enough for transport, and Instructor Keith Varanen, fracture set, wing splinted, refusing sedation with a stubbornness that even the medics did not fight, was still secured in his observer's harness, having spent the entire 90 seconds of the emergency in complete motionless silence, watching. He had watched a cadet with a file that read, "Unfit for command, take command of a dying frigate with no authority to do so, beyond the simple fact that no one else was left standing, and choose, in the space of perhaps 4 seconds, the option that Doctrine did not favor and arithmetic did not clearly recommend." Because he had judged correctly, Varanen now understood with a clarity that felt like something breaking open in his chest, that the cost of being wrong quickly was higher than the cost of being right at a speed that looked, from the outside, exactly like the hesitation Varanen had spent 18 years teaching cadets to fear. He had also watched the cost of that choice arrive, precisely personally, in the body of a 19-year-old Vantar cadet who had done exactly what was asked of him and paid for it in full. And Varanen understood, watching Reyes kneel in the wreckage holding a dead boy's hand with a stillness that had nothing performative in it, that he was looking at something he recognized with a recognition that predated language. A young officer who had made the correct call and would carry the price of it forever. The same way Varanen had carried for 18 years a price he had never once let himself look at directly. He thought for the first time in nearly 2 decades of Dreth. Not the smoothed, simplified Dreth of the official inquiry, hesitation at the tactical station, but the actual shape of the memory underneath. The 4 minutes his nephew had asked for and not been given. The composite ghost Dreth had correctly suspected, and Keith had overridden in the name of the decisiveness his doctrine demanded. He had spent 18 years telling himself the lesson of Threra Strait was that hesitation kills. Watching Tomas Reyes hold a coupling steady through the only kind of decision that had ever actually mattered, fast enough to matter, careful enough to be right, Keith Varanen understood, with the particular vertigo of a man whose foundation has just proven itself built on a lie, he told himself, that the lesson had never been about hesitation at all. It had been about whether a commander could be trusted to know the difference between fear and judgment. And Keith had answered that question at Threra Strait, by refusing to trust the one officer under his command who actually knew. The formal inquiry into the exercise's failure took 11 days. Reyes gave his account of the 90 seconds 4 times, to 4 different review boards, in the flat, careful language that had become, since Sci-Fi's death, the only way he could speak about it at all without his voice breaking somewhere. He could not afford it to break in front of people whose job was to judge him. Nobody blamed him for the coupling housing failure. The metallurgical analysis was unambiguous, a fault in decommissioned hardware no cadet could have anticipated. But knowing that changed nothing about the fact that Sile's family would receive a folded uniform and a citation instead of their son. and Reyes understood with a bleakness that had nothing dramatic in it, that this was simply what the cost had been, and that it did not uncost itself because the review board absolved him. Voronin requested to speak with him privately on the 12th day, in the same observation gallery where the verdict had first been delivered a year earlier, though this time Voronin sat, his splinted wing held awkwardly against his side, and did not stand to deliver anything. "I have read the full sensor logs," Voronin said without preamble, in the flat cadence of a species that did not soften difficult things by approaching them slowly. "Cadet Than's initial calculation gave you a 90% survival probability if you ran. You did not run. I have spent a great deal of the last 11 days attempting to understand why, and I find I already knew the answer before I finished asking the question. You did not choose the 10% risk of a worse outcome for yourself. You chose it to remove a certainty of a worse outcome for everyone in that gallery, myself included, and you did the arithmetic correctly enough, and fast enough, that I am alive to sit here and tell you that I do not think I would have done it faster." Reyes did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which felt for once like the correct choice rather than a failure of one. "I told you a year ago in this room that capability without decisiveness is a weapon no one is willing to close the trigger guard on." Voronin's crest, Reyes noticed, was not flat in the way it had been that day. It sat differently, not relaxed exactly, but no longer arranged as armor. "I was not wrong that decisiveness matters. I was wrong about what decisiveness is. I built an entire doctrine around the idea that speed and certainty are the same thing, because 18 years ago I lost the person I loved most, and a nephew I had raised as my own hatchling, to a formation that looked exactly like the one you refused to fire on in your very first simulation with me. And I have told myself, every year since, that the tragedy was his 4 minutes of hesitation. It was not his hesitation. It was my refusal to trust that a subordinate's caution could be a form of judgment rather than its absence. I overrode him. I gave the order myself, decisively, exactly as Doctrine demanded, and it killed everyone I commanded that day, including him. I rewrote that story in my own memory for 18 years, because the version where I was wrong was not one I knew how to survive teaching from. You have made it very difficult to keep telling myself the other version. The silence that followed was not comfortable, and Voronin did not try to make it so. I am not going to tell you that what happened to Cadet Ithrin does not sit with the weight it sits with, he said finally. It should. If it stopped sitting with that weight, I would no longer trust your judgment at all, because a commander who has stopped feeling the cost of a correct decision has stopped being able to tell the difference between correct and easy. What I am telling you is that I was wrong, publicly and specifically, about you, and that the record will reflect it, and that the doctrine I teach after this will reflect it as well, because I have spent 18 years training this fleet to distrust the exact quality that saved it, and I do not intend to spend 18 more. He rose with the careful stiffness of a splinted wing, and did not offer the closed-fist Vantar salute that cadets learned to expect from senior officers, the fast, decisive gesture that had opened every one of his classes for as long as anyone could remember. Instead, he paused, a full, visible, unhurried pause, the kind of pause his own doctrine had spent a year teaching an entire cohort to fear, before he raised his good wing, slowly, and held it there, and Reyes understood watching it that the pause was the point. It was Voronin's entire 18 years of doctrine, revised in a single silent gesture in front of the one cadet who would understand exactly what it cost him to make it. "Cadet Reyes," Voronin said, "I withdraw my assessment. You are fit for command. You always were. I simply did not yet know how to recognize what fitness looked like when it was not wearing my own face." He left the gallery without waiting for a response because there was nothing left in that sentence that needed one, and Tomas Reyes stood alone by the observation window for a long time afterward, watching the stars hold still outside the glass, thinking of a 19-year-old cadet's hand going slack in his own, and understanding, with a clarity that felt less like victory than like the simple permanent weight of having grown into something he could not set back down, that he had gotten exactly the verdict he had spent a year wanting, and that it had cost precisely as much as verdicts like that always do.